Welcome to lecture 21, where I'll be showing you how to set up realistic metal shaders. The most basic idea is to have something which is shiny, and the easiest thing to do it is in the standard surface shader is just by changing the metalness slider to 1. And by doing that, you can already see this looks like a brushed metal. So before we jump right into it, I want to show you the environment reflection quickly. So if I change my roughness to be 0, you can actually see what we are reflecting. It's lots of lights, lots of shiny things, and already just by changing the roughness to 0, you can see that this looks like a metal object. So let's just change the roughness back to 0.5, how it was. And let's talk a bit more about color and how it affects the metalness. So by having the metalness to 1 and changing the color, you can see that my overall reflection gets stronger the brighter the color gets. And if I boost this up to 1, like a fully white shader, then this is a perfectly reflecting object. Obviously, we still have roughness on 0.5. So if I reduce this to 0, this is now a shader which reflects all the light which is emitting onto the surface. In the real world, a shader like this does not exist. So lots of beginners make the mistake by setting the metalness to 1 and having a color of white and think this is a good shader. But it's not, because it is not physically accurate, because it's way too bright. So a typical color for a chrome shader is around 0.6. So a base color of 0.6 and metalness to 1. And obviously you always have some smudges or roughness on the surfaces. You would play up the roughness maybe to 0.1. And this already looks a lot more realistic. It's not perfect yet because it still feels very clean and very polished. And the reason of this is when you set up a shader on default, it's a totally physical, clean shader, and something like that does really not exist. So if you change the color to something more saturated, this could almost look like a copper, but it's copper in its purest form, which does not really exist in the real life. Normally it's corroded, or it has some scratches or some surface irregularities to it. So definitely always make sure to break up the shaders in several ways I will be showing you just now. Another important aspect of the metalness slider is if you have a color. So first of all, you have a base color which defines the base reflection color, and you have a specular color which is the edge color of that object. So if I bring back the roughness to 0.5, and let's just play up maybe a pink specular color, and you can already see just by doing that we get a edge sheen which is pretty bright pink. And what everything specular does is just changing the color on the edge, like on the 90-degree angle to the surface. So keep that in mind, we will be using this quite a bit. So let's just first reset the shader specular to 1, and let's just set up a specular color, a specular roughness of 0.2. And let's, for instance, try to create something more platinum, something not as chromy as this, but something more maybe lead or something. So what we try to do is have a pretty low base reflectance. So maybe just try 30%. And this should already look pretty good. And now if we just play around with the roughness, we should get something which is very interesting. And obviously a specular color, depending on what material it is, like something like copper or gold, they have more a saturated reflection color. But for titanium, it's mostly a gray reflection as well. So what sometimes people see do is just change it slightly, like a slightly saturation to the edge colors of like a deep blue, like something like this. It's not that apparent in the render, but it's just giving some color on the edges, which is also something which might help your shader. So you might wonder what colors to put in to get a correct base reflection. So luckily there's a nice little node in Arnold which is called complex IOR. So AI complex IOR, it has some very interesting presets. You have lots of metals in here which you can directly use. So if I connect the out color to my base color, let's see what we get for a shader if we head over to copper. Typically this is what we get. It's as I said before, it's a very clean look. Let's try something else. Let's say maybe platinum. And you can see now the platinum shader is a bit more white, but it still has this little bit of orange yellowish tint to it. And if you're still unsure what colors to plug in, you can also find some references on the Arnold specular page. So you can see what values to plug in here. So if you want to do copper, I'm just clicking the color swatch now. So instead of using the complex IOR, I'm just heading to the base color of the shader and I'm just color picking that copper color. And then we can also do kind of the same color for the specular color. So let's just pick that and see what we get. So I think this looks very odd, and let's see what color values we actually get, what color ranges. So we have a red of 2, which is definitely way too high. We should actually have something in a range of 251, 165, and 139. So the color picking did not work as expected. So let's just do 251, 165, and 139. And just use the same color there as well. So according to the Arnold page, this is what copper looks like. And if we compare this to the copper of the complex IOR, let's see what we get. There's definitely a shift in color. So I think the complex IOR is measured data, and I'm not sure where they got the color from the documentation. So definitely not the same. But let's just go on and continue working on that shader. So I don't want to use a complex IOR right now, so I'm just deleting that node, and I'll be just choosing something more artist friendly, and I'm just going to choose something a bit more darker, and we will give it a edge color of something more yellowish to get something warm to the shader. And this will be my starting point for our metal shader. So the first thing which I want to do is break up the surface with some specular adjustments. So I'm a big fan of the curvature node just because it gives you so much nice detail and breakup. So let's use this as a specular roughness. So creating the AI curvature node and just plug this into our specular roughness. And on default, because it outputs a almost black image, it gets very shiny. So let's do isolate selected, hit the curvature node and play up the radius maybe to 0.4, boost up the samples to maybe 6 to get more details. And if this is not enough, feel free to just boost up the multiplier to get a stronger output. And now you can see we get some really cool things onto the surface as well. Because the base is still very black, we get a very shiny surface. So what I like to do is I just create a range, which I talked in a previous lecture what it really does. So I'm just connecting the out color to the input, and then I'm just using the out color red of the range and connect that to the specular roughness. By just doing that, there will be no difference. But what I want to do now is I just want to change the output min color to something lighter. So maybe try a base output of, let's try 0.3, which should give us a very bright image. And then the output max is 1, but we want to go a bit more defined on these edges, I think. So currently, if I hover over, we have a value of 0.3, maybe 4 on these wider edges. So let's just change my input max maybe to 0.5, and now you can see we get a lot lighter edge, maybe 0.4, and it gets a bit brighter, 0.3. Let's just try and see what we get by just doing this basic change. And I'm disabling the isolation mode, and let's see what our helmet looks like now. Okay, we're definitely something happening. I just think that I went too far with the input min, so let's just reduce this maybe to 0.15. So we get a very shiny helmet, but now you can see on the edges we get this nice breakup. Also here, it's nice and rough looking. So still I think it's still very clean and too perfect, the surface. So first of all, I think it's overall a bit too shiny. So let's go maybe to 0.2 for the output min. Just render the top part of the helmet. And what I like to do now is we can see there is definitely some detail. So we can just boost up the roughness a bit more. The radius. Maybe let's go to 0.6. So now you can start seeing there's some structure on the helmet too, which is interesting, which is something we want to play up a bit more. And what I also like to do is I want to create a noise pattern. And I want to plus this output with the range. Like I just want to combine those two nodes together. So I'm just creating a composite node, which should have a add function or like a max. Actually, max will always take the maximum value of either pixel. So let's just connect this here and this there, and then just connect the out red to the spec roughness and view from the composite node. Now you can see those two together look like this. Very interesting. It's not something where we definitely something we need to improve. So heading over to the noise, I just want to make it a bit larger scale. So maybe half the scale to make the noise larger. And then I want to introduce a bit more octaves, which gives us more detail. And I want to use distortion as well. So this kind of looks like a dented helmet, which is exactly what we were going for. So if I now look at the composite node, you can see they have been added together, but I still think it's a bit too strong. So let's just reduce the color to be a bit darker and see what the composite looks like now. And also let's check the render. And now you can see we actually get a nice broken up texture on the helmet itself. Might be a bit strong, so let's just reduce the color of the noise a bit more. And this is now fine-tuning the shader until you're happy with something. And because we did all that, what I want to do now is use this noise pattern as a bump as well. So let's just create a bump 2D and use the out color of the noise and plug it to the bump map and connect the out value to the normal camera. On default, it's a very low value, so we should not see really much happening. So let's just boost this maybe to 0.1. And now you can see a very interesting effect. You can see that we get some bump on the same patterns where we just increased the roughness. So let's play this up a bit more, maybe 0.2. And now you can see that the helmet already looks like rusty and corroded. And this is definitely getting more into the more realistic metal shaders, because there's no metal which is super clean, except it comes right from the factory, right? Super clean metals are very rare. Like even if you check your phone and it has some nice metal bevels, they are mostly dented or scratched, or it's not clean or perfect. So this would be now the first step of this shader. I think the bump is a bit too strong. So let's just go maybe 0.175 and render that. And for the next step, what I like to do is I want to play a bit with occlusion. And what occlusion enables us is to catch little nudges and crevices, and then we have the power to manipulate them as well. So while this renders, I just want to create an AI occlusion node. And I want to connect this up to the ID slot just to be able to use the isolation mode. So by selecting isolate, you can see what we get on default. So let's just change the far clip to maybe 30 or maybe 15. Make sure self only is on and swap the black and white colors. So now whatever is white is our occlusion. And we will be using this to change our base color. Before we do that though, what I like to do is actually plug in a little map into our black slot. And I will be using a noise as well. And I'm just connecting this the out color to the black slot. And just by doing that, we can see now we get some pattern into the shader. We need to play it up a bit. So let's just change the scale to maybe 0.1. And now it's not as uniform as it was before. It's going up and down. It's not as clean as it was before. So let's introduce a bit more levels, more detail. And you can see we get a nice effect. We can also play up the distortion some more, just to break up, like everything is about breaking up the texture or the surface, just to get more detail. So I think this works already pretty good. We have a matte, a white color of 0.1. The only thing what I like to do is just boost the output a bit. So before we plug this into a color correction node, I just want to create an AI range from the AI color, and then I want to create an AI color correct node, which enables us to color grade the input, connect the range output red to a mask, and let's see what base color we have here. So on default we have this gray color. So I'm just checking the values of 50 units. Let's just check what it is. Actually, it's a 20% gray. So let's just use the same color in my AI color correct node as the input color. Input, let's actually go a bit lower. So let's use maybe 0.15. So this is 15% gray. And connect the out color of that color correction node back to my base color. So essentially we have the same shader as before. The only difference is now we have a mask connected to a color correction node, and now we are able to actually change the color on these crevices, which we have seen before. So if I would change the exposure into a negative value, you can slowly see that we are changing the color input on the occluded areas. So we can further reduce the exposure to maybe -10, and now we can see that we hit our limits in color correcting this. So as I said before, we need to connect the range to actually make our mattes, our black and white image, a bit stronger in the whiter tones. So I'm just reducing the input max to a value of maybe 0.3, this should boost our matte quite a bit. So now it's ranging up to 0.3. Maybe let's go a bit further to 0.2. And now we should have pretty high values on the whites. We can also enable clamping, that we don't go higher than whites, than 1. So let's see what our color correct looks like now. So just based on this, we can see we almost have a black color in the base. So this might be a bit too much. So let's just bring it back up a bit. And now this is our base image. So we can see it gets really dark here and dark in these edges. So let's see what the render looks like. And you can now already see how big the difference is. You can see that the color is changing where it's like where it has ridges, and it's getting darker at the bottom here. So this is a very interesting effect, and this should help a lot to add more realism to this. So one last thing which I like to do is, if I head over to the shader again, I just want to introduce a code as well. It's just an interesting effect which might be something you are after. So let's just render the top part of the helmet and maybe just increase the overall roughness. Currently it's connected to a map. So let's just check the map composite and just add a color correct node after. So AI color correction, hit the out color to the input, and from the color correction, we connect the red channel to the spec roughness. And what we can do now is we can just boost our roughness by maybe an exposure of 0.2. And you can see it overall gets a bit rougher. 0.5, it gets even more rougher. And this is now almost too much, but we can work with this. So if we head over to the code, and I'm enabling this now with a value of 1, you can now see that the whole object gets actually very shiny, but underneath you can see there is still the same bump pattern to this. And normally you don't get this, because this would mean that our metal is coated with like a little thin film of plastic maybe, or it's some clear coat of spray paint or something like that. But it might be the case that this is a helmet which has been restored, or it's in a museum or something, and they tend to actually polish it or actually clear coat the objects. So I think it's maybe too much. So let's just play it down maybe 20%. And you can now see that it gives you a very interesting feel to the whole helmet. It's not as dirty or used up as before. So just by applying these techniques, you should be able to create a very interesting looking metal shader. And I'm sure you can come up with really great things, like especially if you go outside and check these sculptures, or there's some iron busts and you can see how really used up and dark the metal gets, and sometimes you can actually some green corrosion on top of that. So feel free to experiment with the input I gave you on this and create your own metal shaders, and definitely play around with the edge color, like the specular color itself, with roughness, and definitely with bump, because the bump maps in general, they add just a lot more realism to any surface, because breakup is the key to create good looking shaders. Thank you for watching this lecture about metal, and I hope this helped you a lot in your future renderings.